The forge had not been lit in 3 days. Maren told himself it was the heat. Midsummer had come down hard on the valley, pressing through the thatched roof of his workshop and pooling in the low corners of the room like something alive. He told himself that nobody needed ironwork in the middle of summer, that the farmers had their tools, that the horses had their shoes, that the only thing anyone wanted forged right now was shade and a cold drink, and neither of those were things he was particularly good at making. He told himself a great many things in those days. The truth was that the forge had been going cold more and more often in the past 2 years, and it had nothing to do with the heat. It had everything to do with the way a house sounds when it has held 2 people for a long time, and then there is only one. Not silence, exactly. Something worse. A kind of acoustic memory where you keep expecting a sound that doesn't come. The particular footfall from the bedroom above. The small clatter of a cup being set down in the kitchen with a certain impatience. The hum that she had never been aware she was making, low and tuneless, while she worked. Edda had left in the early spring of 2 years ago, and she had not left quietly. She had left with packed bags and a face full of things she'd apparently been holding for a long time, and the man she had left for had been a cobbler named Holger, who worked in the next valley and who made, by all accounts, very fine boots. Maren had nothing against boots. What filled him instead was a blank, terrible feeling of having missed something. Not Edda, precisely. Or not only Edda, but the version of himself that had existed in the certainty that his life was arranged correctly. He was 34 years old, and his forge was dusty, and his order book was nearly empty, and he ate most of his meals standing over the kitchen counter because sitting down at the table for one felt like participating in a ceremony he hadn't agreed to. The anvil was his father's, and his father's father's before that. It was a beautiful piece of iron, deeply pocked and marked by 3 generations of hands, and it sat in the center of his workshop with a kind of patient reproach. Maren walked past it every morning on his way to open the shutters, and every evening on his way to close them, and every time he felt a small, dull shame that was beginning to feel like simply the weather of his life. He was thinking about none of this on the afternoon the circus came to town. He heard at first drums and something that might have been a horn, and underneath both a low human roar that meant people gathering. He came out from the back of his house where he'd been half-heartedly splitting wood and looked down the road toward the village square, and what he saw was color. Vivid and slightly jarring color. The kind that seemed aggressive in the flat summer light. Red and yellow and a deep jewel green that didn't belong to anything growing. A procession of wagons wound down from the mountain road, each one painted and hung with banners. The people walking alongside them were dressed in things that had no business being worn in a working day. A man in a tall plumed hat was distributing papers at the edge of the crowd. Maren took one when it was pressed into his hand. Marvel at the extraordinary. Witness the unbelievable. The wandering spectacle of Master Corso brings you wonders from the edges of the known world. Acrobats, illusionists, fire-eaters, and the crown jewel of our collection, the magnificent Nelsha, the orc of the eastern mountains, in a display of ancient serpent dance that will haunt your dreams for years. One night only. Tonight. 5 gold coins. Admission. Maren looked at the paper for a long time. 5 gold coins was not a small sum. It was more than he had made in the past 2 weeks. He thought about the fact that he hadn't done anything purely for the pleasure of it in more months than he could clearly count. And then he went inside and pulled the old sock from beneath his bed. the one in the very back corner against the wall where Edda had never looked, and counted out 5 gold coins from the small hoard inside and put them in his coat pocket. He told himself it was just to get out of the house. The tent they'd erected in the field south of the square was enormous, strung with lanterns that turned the summer dusk into something theatrical and strange. Maren paid his 5 coins to a large woman with tired eyes who didn't look at him, and he found a seat on the 3rd bench back, and the show began. It was, he had to admit, impressive in the way that all such things are impressive. The jugglers who moved with a precision that made it look effortless, the fire-eaters who played the crowd's fear like an instrument, the acrobats who seemed to treat gravity as a personal inconvenience. He watched with the pleasant, half-removed feeling of a man who has allowed himself, just this once, to be somewhere other than inside his own head. And then, when the tent had reached its peak of noise and light and laughter, the drums changed. They went from a bright, rhythmic tumbling to something slower, something with a low pulse in it that you felt in your chest before you heard it clearly. The torches were dimmed. The crowd settled. From the back of the tent, through the entrance curtain, she walked. She was tall, taller than any woman Maren had seen, and broader through the shoulders, and the torchlight caught the green-gray of her skin and turned it to something that shimmered faintly, like deep water under overcast sky. Her hair was black and pinned back with what looked like copper wire. She wore a costume of deep red cloth that moved when she moved, and coiled around her shoulders was a serpent, easily as long as Maren's arm span, dark-patterned and heavy, which she moved with a complete absence of fear that was its own kind of spectacle. The crowd reacted the way crowds do to something that frightens and fascinates simultaneously. There were gasps and some laughter that was too loud, the kind of laughter that comes from discomfort finding its nearest exit, and a man 2 rows ahead muttered something about demons that Maren chose not to hear clearly. She danced. It was not the kind of dance that performs. It was the kind of dance that remembers. There was something ancient in the movement of her arms, in the way she and the serpent moved as one thing rather than a woman and an animal she was managing, and Maren watched her with the full attention he hadn't given anything in a very long time. Not the spectacle of her, not the otherness, not the creature she was being sold as, but her face. Her face was still, not the stillness of concentration, though that was part of it. The stillness of someone who has gone very far away inside themselves and left only enough presence behind to keep the body moving. It was the face of someone performing a thing they have no particular relationship with anymore. It was the face, Maren thought with a lurch of recognition so precise it was almost physical, of a person who has stopped expecting anything to be different. He knew that face. He saw it in his shaving mirror every morning. The crowd applauded when the dance ended. That mixed applause of people who have been genuinely moved and are somewhat embarrassed about it, and the drums returned to their bright commercial pace, and the torches came back up and it was over. People began to file out past him, talking, and Maren sat still on his bench for a moment, thinking about her face, and then he did something that he could not, later, fully explain. He went around the back of the tent. He told himself he only wanted to check that the serpent was all right. But it was also not entirely the truth. The back of the tent opened onto a kind of temporary village. Wagons arranged in a rough square, cook fires, the smell of horses and sawdust, and something sweet and slightly chemical that he didn't recognize. He walked slowly, a man who was not doing anything wrong and knew it, and rounded the back of the largest wagon. He stopped. She was sitting on the ground with her back against the wagon wheel, still in the performance costume, and around her neck was an iron collar, and from the collar ran a chain that was bolted to the wagon's rear axle. The serpent had been returned to its box somewhere. He could hear it moving. The woman herself had her knees drawn up and her forehead resting on them, and she was not making any sound, but her shoulders had the particular set of someone who has been crying for long enough that crying no longer produces any relief. Maren stood there for 3 full seconds of pure, silent fury. Then he made a small sound, not intentional, just the sharp intake of breath that comes before speech, and her head snapped up and she was looking at him with eyes that had gone hard and flat, the way an animal's eyes go hard and flat when it's been cornered too many times. "Get away," she said. Her voice was lower than he'd expected, rough at the edges. "Whatever you want, get away. Shows are finished." "I don't want anything from the show," Maren said. His own voice sounded strange to him, too quiet. "I saw—" He stopped. "Is there anyone watching you right now?" A pause. She assessed him with those flat, careful eyes. "Does it matter?" "It matters because I have a very large pair of bolt cutters in my workshop, and I can be back here in less than 10 minutes. Another pause. Longer. Something shifted in her face. Not trust exactly, but the ghost of a question. "You'd be in trouble," she said. "I'm already in trouble," Moran said, which was not quite what he meant, but wasn't untrue either. "I'll be back." He went. He realized later, not thinking at all, not weighing outcomes or calculating risk, not doing any of the careful, sensible arithmetic that had governed the last 2 years of his life. He moved through the dark on the momentum of a feeling he hadn't had in a long time, which was the feeling that something needed to be done, and he was the person who was going to do it. The bolt cutters were hanging on the 3rd hook from the door. He grabbed his heavy work coat off the peg on his way out, because the summer evening still got cold in the valley, and he went back. She was still there. She watched him come back across the dark field with an expression that he couldn't read. Not disbelief exactly, but the close cousin of it. He crouched beside her without speaking and looked at the chain and the collar and the bolt of iron at the wagon axle. The collar was an ugly thing, functional rather than punitive, but terrible for exactly that reason. Someone had looked at this problem and reached for metalwork, and that someone had known what they were doing. He fit the cutters to the chain link closest to the axle and leaned into it, and the link gave with a sound like a small explosion that made them both freeze listening. Nothing. The camp sounds continued undisturbed. He cut a second link, and then the chain was loose, and he let it fall to the ground with what seemed to him an obscenely casual sound. The collar itself would need a key he didn't have, and cutting so close to her neck wasn't something he was willing to do in the dark with adrenaline in his hands. He put the coat around her shoulders without touching her, just held it open and set it carefully over her, and straightened up. "There's going to be a lot of noise," she said. Not a question. Eventually, "Come on." She stood. She was taller than him by nearly a full head, and she moved, despite everything, with a quality that he could only describe as composed, the remnant chain trailing behind her through the grass as they walked quickly away from the wagons and into the dark. They didn't speak on the way to his house. He kept 2 paces ahead of her, close enough that she could follow, but not so close that she would feel managed, and he moved through the back lanes rather than the main road, because that was simply sense. His front door was unlocked, as it always was, and he held it open without comment. She stopped on the threshold. He went inside and lit the lamp on the kitchen table, and then stepped back, giving her the room, and after a moment she came in. She took in the kitchen, the clutter of it, the single cup on the counter, the cold hearth, with a quick, comprehensive scan that took in more than he thought most people would notice. Then she stood with her arms crossed and the remnant of the chain looped around one hand and watched him. "You can sit," Maren said. "Or not. Do you want something to eat?" "What do you want?" "Nothing." He turned to the hearth to start a fire. "I want to know that wound is taken care of, and that's it." "What wound?" "Your neck." A silence. He built the fire without looking at her. After a moment, he heard her pull out the chair and sit. The collar had left a mark, a raw, abraded ring around her throat from years of exactly this. He boiled water and found clean cloth and the small jar of salve he kept for burns, and he set them all on the table in front of her and said, "I'd like to clean this if you'll let me. I'll tell you what I'm doing before I do it." She looked at the supplies and then at him. "Why?" "Because you don't know me. Because I want someone to ask." Another silence. Then, carefully, as if each word had been examined before it left her mouth. "All right." He worked slowly, and he narrated every step as he'd promised. "I'm going to wet the cloth now. This will be cold. I'm going to press here." And she sat very still and let him, though he could feel the sustained effort of that stillness in the set of her jaw and the careful control of her breathing. The mark was worse than he'd hoped, and not as bad as he'd feared. He applied the salve and wrapped the cloth loosely and sat back. "My name is Maren," he said. A long pause. "Nelsha," she said. "Nelsha." He nodded. "You should sleep. I'll take the floor. You, the bed's through there. The door has a bolt." He got up and began clearing the supplies from the table. "There's no obligation. When morning comes, you can leave whenever you want, and I won't ask where you're going." She was quiet for a long time, and he moved around the kitchen not watching her, cleaning up with the habitual motions of a man who has done all his household tasks alone long enough that they've become meditative. He was almost finished when she spoke again. "I've been freed before," she said. "It didn't mean anything. They sold me again." Maren set down what he was holding and turned to look at her. She was watching him with the same flat, careful attention she'd given him since the wagon, looking for the things she expected to find, the calculation under the kindness. The price. "That won't happen here," he said. Not a promise to persuade her, just a fact, the way you state facts. She looked at him for another moment. Then she got up without speaking and went to the bedroom, and he heard the bolt slide home, and he found a blanket and lay down on the kitchen floor and listened to the summer night outside until he fell asleep. He woke before dawn as he always did, and he woke to the sound of voices in the street. Not many voices, not yet, but the particular urgent murmur of people passing news between themselves, the sound of a thing spreading. He lay still and listened, and through the thin walls he heard it clearly enough. The circus had something missing, and they were looking. He got up and went to the window. The street was still mostly dark, but two men with lanterns were moving slowly along the row of houses, and the quality of their movement was the quality of a search. A sound behind him. He turned. Nelsha was in the bedroom doorway, dressed, watching him. "They're looking," she said. Her voice was flat, like she was reporting weather. "Yes." "I should go." "Where?" The question stopped her. He watched her face do something, not collapse. Nothing so dramatic, but a kind of quiet acknowledgement, like a door settling in its frame. She had nowhere to go. He'd seen it in her face the moment she'd sat down last night, and his kitchen had apparently been a more plausible refuge than anything else on offer. "Stay inside," he said. "Keep away from the windows. I'll go out. You'll tell them. I'll tell them nothing. He pulled on his coat. Make yourself some breakfast if you want. The bread is from yesterday, but it's still good. He went out into the early morning and walked down to the edge of his property with his hands in his pockets, and when the two circus men came past with their lanterns, he nodded at them with the slow friendliness of a man who has been up since before dawn, because that is simply how he is. "Morning," said the larger of the two. "You haven't seen anything unusual? We're missing one of our performers." "Which one?" A brief pause. "The Orc woman." Marin scratched his jaw and appeared to think about this. "Can't say I have." "What happened?" "She's been known to wander," the man said, which was a way of putting it that made something behind Marin's sternum go very still. "If you see anything, send word to our camp." "Of course," Marin said pleasantly, and watched them go. When he went back inside, Nelsha was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of water, watching the closed door. She hadn't touched the bread. "They've gone down the lane," Marin said. "They'll be back in a few hours when they've run out of other options." "You lied to them." "I said I hadn't seen anything unusual." He sat down across from her. "You're not unusual. You're a person." She looked at him for a long time with that careful, measuring look. Then she picked up the bread and ate it. He told her that day about the chain on the wagon axle, that he'd seen it and understood what it was, and she told him, in the flattest possible way, the broad architecture of her life. "Stolen young," she said, young enough that the parents she'd been taken from were more a feeling than a memory, a warmth and a smell and the particular quality of being held safely, all of which had stopped with such abruptness that the absence had become structural, a load-bearing wall inside her built from what was not there, sold 3 times. Bought by the circus 8 years ago and kept since then because she could be useful and because, as she said with no particular inflection, she was difficult to lose. "There are not so many orcs in these parts," she said. "I stand out." "Yes," Marin said. "This is a problem. There are ways through the mountain pass that aren't the main road." He had been thinking about this since before dawn. There's an old logging track that comes out south of the valley. It's slow, but it's not a road anyone uses for commerce. He paused. "If you have somewhere to go." She looked at the table for a moment. Then, with a quality that he recognized as something being let out carefully, the way you open a pressure valve with control rather than all at once, she reached into the costume he now saw she was still wearing beneath his coat and drew out a small locket on a cord. She set it on the table between them. It was a plain thing, worked copper, small enough to close in the palm. He didn't touch it. After a moment, she opened it herself. Inside, faded almost to illegibility but still clear in its essential shapes, was a tiny painted image. 2 figures, large, the particular green-gray that was her own coloring, and between them a small figure that was unmistakably a child. The 3 of them were posed with the stiff formality of people who have been asked to hold still for something important, but even in that formality there was something in the way the adults were angled toward the child that said everything that mattered. "I had it when they took me," Nelsha said. "I don't know how. I think," a pause, "I think I had it in my hand. I must have been holding it." Marin looked at the image for a long time. "Do you know where they are?" "I know the name of the place." She touched the edge of the locket without closing it. "In the mountains. East, I think. I've always known the name, I just—" She stopped. "Never had anywhere to go from," Marin said. She looked at him sharply, as if she'd expected something different from that sentence, and then looked away. Yes. He got up and went to the shelf where he kept his map's old things, worn at the folds that had been his father's, and began to look. In the days that followed, they existed in a careful parallel. She stayed out of sight during the daylight hours, while the circus search moved through the village with diminishing urgency, the tension slowly bleeding out as the circus people began to accept what they would not accept publicly. On the second day, he came home to find that she had swept the kitchen and sorted the pile of iron fittings he'd left by the workshop door with a precision that suggested she knew what she was looking at. He didn't comment on it. She didn't explain. He found her one afternoon sitting at his workbench, his tools spread out around her. He stopped in the doorway. She had his smallest rasp in her hand and was drawing it with great deliberate care across a piece of scrap iron that she had somehow contrived to heat. The small portable brazier was lit, which explained the smell, and the edge she was working was developing a taper so clean it looked like it had been born that way rather than made. She hadn't heard him come in. He watched her work for nearly a minute before she sensed him and looked up. Something crossed her face, the beginning of the expression that would have apologized or defended. And then it stopped. She looked at the rasp in her hand and then at him. "You know ironwork," he said. "Some," she said, and set the rasp down, and that was all she said. But when he came back an hour later, the scrap piece was on the work table, and the taper was finished, and it was, objectively, a better piece of work than anything he'd done in 3 months. On the fourth evening, he lit the forge properly for the first time in a week and a half, and she stood in the doorway watching without comment, and the sound of it. The particular breathing sound of a forge finding its temperature, the smell of good coal reaching heat, did something to him that he had no immediate vocabulary for. It felt like something that had been held very tightly being let go. She made supper most evenings, working in his kitchen with a quiet economy that made it clear she had learned to cook in places where waste was not an option. The food was better than anything he'd made himself. He didn't tell her this. He thought she probably knew. One night, when the fire in the kitchen hearth had burned down to coals and the village outside had gone entirely quiet, she put her cup down on the table and said, "I had a father who made things. I remember the sound of it." Maren looked at his hands, which were wrapped around his own cup. "What kind of things?" "Metal things. Good ones." A pause. "I remember the sound of the hammer at night when I was small. It meant we were safe. It meant someone was awake and working, and we were—" She stopped. In the dark and the firelight, and her face was very still. "I haven't thought about that in a long time." "Why now?" A silence. Then quietly, without looking at him, "Your forge sounds the same." He didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say to that wouldn't make it smaller. And after a while, she picked her cup back up, and they sat in the quiet together, and the fire settled, and outside the summer dark breathed slowly in and out, and he thought about what it was to carry something that long a sound, a memory, the warmth between 3 people and a painted image small enough to close in a fist. And he thought about his own father's forge and the sound of it that had meant exactly the same thing to exactly the same part of him, and he understood something about her that didn't have a name precisely, but didn't need one. He said eventually, "If you'd known what was coming." She considered this seriously, the way she considered everything. "I would have stayed close," she said. "I would have—" A pause. "I would have held on better." The thing about that answer was that it had no self-pity in it. It was just information. He found that he respected it very much. "I would have stayed in the forge," Maren said. "Not gone to the town, not—" He stopped himself. Old accounting. I made choices based on what I thought other people thought was sensible, and I lost things I hadn't known I was holding. Your wife? My direction, he said, which was more honest than the other answer. She just made it visible. She nodded as if she understood this, which he suspected she did. They left on the 5th day before dawn, with as little as could be managed. Marin's pack with food and tools and his maps. Nelsha wearing clothes he'd found in a chest that had been Edda's too short, but adequate, and the locket on its cord at her throat. The collar mark was healing. He didn't say so. She didn't mention it either. The logging track was overgrown but navigable, and they made good time through the morning, moving through dense summer forest where the light came through in columns and the air smelled of pine resin and heat and something wilder underneath. She moved well, better than him actually. She had a natural reading of terrain that he'd learned to respect by the 2nd hour, and he found himself unconsciously following her line rather than setting his own. They didn't talk much while walking. That turned out to be all right. 3 days before they left, a woman named Gert came to his door. She was not the worst of his neighbors, which was why he'd always liked her, and she was not the best, which was why her visit landed with the particular weight that it did. She was a woman of perhaps 50 who had lived on the lane longer than he had, who had known his mother, who had brought him a covered dish the week after Edda left, with a note that said nothing in particular and meant everything by its presence. He valued her opinion. She came in the afternoon when Nelsha was in the back room out of sight, and she sat down at the table and wrapped her hands around the cup of tea he set in front of her, and looked at him with an expression he hadn't seen on her face before, which was the expression of someone preparing to say something that they know will cost something. "Marin," she said, "people are talking. People always talk. They're saying you have her here. The circus woman." She paused. "The orc." He sat down across from her and said nothing. "I don't know what happened," Gert said carefully, "and I'm not here to make trouble. You know that, but there are people in this village, good people, people who've been here all their lives, who are frightened. They've never..." She stopped. "They've never seen one before, up close, and the circus men have been telling stories about what she did, what her kind does. What do they say she did? That she was controlled for a reason. That..." Gert set her cup down and looked at her own hands. "That orcs are violent, by nature. That keeping her in the village is putting everyone at risk." Marin looked at the table for a moment. Then he said carefully, "Gert, how long have you known me?" 20 years, near enough." "In 20 years, have I given you reason to think I'm a fool?" A pause. "No." "Then believe me when I tell you that the risk in this village is not her." He met her eyes. "I have been alone in that house with her for 6 days. She has swept my kitchen. She has mended the catch on my gate. She has made better bread than I've made in 2 years. He paused. "She has been afraid," he said more quietly. "Every day since I brought her here, but she hasn't shown it because she has learned that showing fear gives people permission to do what they were already considering. That is not violence by nature. That is survival." Gert was quiet for a long time. He watched her face work through something. The received story and the face in front of her, and the gap between them. "I'm not asking you to like it," he said. "I'm asking you to not add your voice to theirs, because you know how this village works, and you know that your voice carries further than most." She looked at him. Then she looked at the table. Then she picked up her cup and drank the last of her tea and set it down and said, "She's leaving soon?" "In a few days." "Then I suggest," Gert said, with the measured precision of a woman making a specific and considered choice, that those few days go quietly. She pushed her chair back and stood. I'll see to it that they do. She left, and he sat at the table for a while, listening to the house, and then he went to the back room and told Nelsha they would leave earlier than planned. On the second day after that, the trouble came in a larger shape. He heard them at dusk, not coming to the door, but gathered at the end of the lane, a cluster of men he recognized and a few he didn't, the kind of gathering that starts as talk and becomes something else once it's been standing in one place long enough for the talk to run out. The circus owners were there too. He could see their colors at the back, and beside the circus, men stood a minor official with a document roll. He went back inside. There are 8 men in the lane, he said. Some from the village, some from the circus. There's an official with paperwork. Nelsha set down what she was doing. Her face had gone back to the still water of the circus tent. He recognized it now for what it was, the face that endures, that knows how to wait out a storm. And she looked at him with no particular expression and said, "What do we do?" He thought about it for exactly as long as he needed to, which was not very long. "We leave tonight," he said. "Not in an hour." Now, he went to the shelf and took down the pack he'd already half assembled and began moving with the particular efficiency of a man who has decided something and is not second-guessing it. The track is navigable in the dark for the first mile. After that, the moon will be up. She was already moving. He noticed, watching her gather what little she'd acquired in 6 days under his roof. The borrowed clothes, the locket from its place at her throat, a small wrapped package he recognized as the iron piece she'd been finishing on his workbench, that she traveled light in the way of someone who had always had to. He went to the door and looked out. The gathering at the end of the lane was still there, still the quality of talk, but the official with the paperwork was speaking to one of the circus men, and the gesture of his hand was the gesture of someone describing a route. They were still at the stage where they believed the paperwork would do the work for them. He picked up his pack. "I want you to know," he said, turning to find her ready at the kitchen door, "that I'm not afraid of those men." She looked at him with the closest thing to dry humor he'd seen on her face. "You don't need to convince me. I know, I'm saying it for myself." He nodded toward the back door. "The yard, then the hedge gap at the bottom. Stay low until we reach the tree line." They went. On the second day, the track leveled out onto a high ridge from which, on clear mornings, the eastern mountains were visible. They stopped there to rest and eat, and Nelsha looked east for a long time without speaking, and Maran sat on a fallen log and looked at her face and thought about that painted image. The 2 large figures angling toward the small one, and the way a person shapes themselves around an absence long enough that the absence becomes load-bearing. "We'll find it," he said. She looked at him sideways. "You don't know that." "No," he agreed. "But we will." On the 3rd morning, coming down from the ridge into the upper valley, they were stopped. There were 6 of them, 3 from the circus. He recognized 2 of the faces, and 3 men he didn't know. The circus men had ropes. The strangers had the look of men who had been paid money and didn't particularly care what for, which was in some ways the more dangerous kind. The biggest of the circus men, the one who'd walked his lane that first morning, looked at Marin with an expression that was not quite anger, something colder. "That's her," he said, "and the man who helped her." Marin stepped forward, not fast, not aggressive. He simply stepped forward and put himself at the physical front of the 2 of them, between Nelsha and the 6 men, and he stood still. "The chain was on the axle of your wagon," he said. His voice came out very level. He was aware of Nelsha behind him, and he was aware of the road and the trees and the quality of the morning, and he was aware that he was frightened, and he set the fear aside the way you set a tool aside when you need your hands free. On the axle, like livestock. She's contracted to Master Corso. She's a person. Still level, still still. I'm going to need you to show me the contract. A pause. What? The contract. Show it to me. If she's under contract, signed by her hand, then we have something to discuss. Show it to me. The man looked at his companions. None of them moved. I don't need to. You do, Maren said, actually. Because what I saw was a person in a collar chained to a wagon, and what I did was take the chain off. And if that's a crime, then there needs to be paperwork somewhere that says so, and you need to show it to me. Or you need to go to the magistrate in the next town, and I'll come with you, and we can have this discussion in front of him. He paused. Which would you prefer? He watched the circus man's face do its arithmetic. The cost of making this legal versus the cost of not making this legal. And he stood in the road and did not move, and behind him, he was aware of Nelsha, very still, watching. She's mine, the man said, and his voice had gone flat in a way that meant he was past the arithmetic now. She's not, Maren said. And then, because there was a moment when only specific words work, he said, she split my firewood for a week. She fixed the latch on my workshop door that I've been meaning to fix for 2 years. She made supper 4 nights running, and she didn't have to. Tell me exactly, specifically, in what way she is a threat to you. Tell me what she has taken from you, because I will stand here all day while you try to find the words. The moment lasted long enough that he stopped being certain what was going to happen. And then the large man looked at the strangers he'd paid, and the strangers looked back at him with the expression of men who had agreed to collect property and were now being asked to commit something with a different name. And the man looked back at Maren, and the mathematics shifted again. This isn't over, he said. Yes, it is, Maren said. I think you know that. They left. It took another minute of that specific quality of held breath, but they left, and Maren stood in the road watching them go until the trees had closed behind them, and then he let out the breath he had been holding and turned around. Nelsha was looking at him with an expression he'd never seen on her face before. Not soft, exactly. Something older than soft. Something that looked, he thought, like recognition. You didn't have to do that, she said. Yes, I did, he said simply. She looked at him for another long moment. Then she said a word he hadn't heard before, a single word in a language he didn't know, and it came out of her with the quality of something that had been held for a long time and was finally finding where it went. What does that mean? He asked. She was quiet for a moment, looking for the translation. It means... She paused. Orath. It means to stand in front of. To place your body between someone and what would harm them, when you are not required to. He turned the word over. Is it a common word? No, she said. It is not a word for common things. They walked in silence for a while, and the road wound down through the trees, and the morning light shifted and changed, and after a time she said quietly, without looking at him, Your face. At the circus. When you watched me dance. Yes. What did you see? He thought about this for several steps. Myself, he said. 6 months ago. She nodded once, like something had been confirmed. That evening, sitting by a small fire, she said, I didn't do it to own you. What you did, I know that. I know you know that, Maren said. I'm saying it out loud because... She stopped, began again. Because in my experience, things that are true are better when they've been said. in case the knowing isn't enough. He looked at her across the fire. The light was doing something complicated to her face, warm and uncertain and entirely unlike the still water calm of the performing mask. This face was, he didn't have a word for it either. Open, maybe. Present. The face of someone who had decided to stop being somewhere else. "I didn't do it to own you," he said. "I did it because you were worth doing it for. Your face in that tent, I knew that face. I knew it, and I couldn't." He stopped. "I couldn't leave it." She looked at him for a long time. Then she closed her hand around the locket at her throat, and she said, "Oreth," again, very quietly, like she was placing it. He tried to say it back. He didn't get it quite right. The sound at the end was wrong, too closed. She showed him where to put his tongue. He tried again. "Better," she said, and something crossed her face that was so close to a smile that he decided to treat it as one. On the morning of the 7th day, they came down from the eastern pass into a valley he'd never seen on any map, and what he found there stopped him at the rim of the path. The settlement was built into the cliff face itself, a layering of structures that had clearly grown over generations to fit the rock like a second skin, and from every level and every opening there came a sound, the sound of forges. Not one forge, dozens, the chorus of iron at heat, of hammers finding their particular voice against the anvil, of the bellows and the coal, and the good deep work of metal being convinced into new shapes. The sound filled the valley and echoed off the far cliff and came back layered and rich, a sound like music that had decided to be useful instead. Nelsha had stopped beside him. Her face had gone very still. "This is it," she said. "I know it. I don't remember it, but She pressed her hand against her sternum. "I know it." They went down. The people who came out to meet them were cautious, the way isolated communities are cautious, but their eyes went immediately to Nelsha and stayed there with a quality that was not suspicion, but something much older and more desperate than suspicion. An older woman came forward. The grey at her temples was the grey of iron shavings. Her hands were the hands of a smith. And she stopped 3 feet from Nelsha and looked at her face and her hands and the mark at her throat, and something in her own face broke open and then reformed around what had broken, the way metal does when it's worked past a certain temperature. She said a name. Not Nelsha, something shorter. The name the child in the locket had been called. The name that had been given before there was a circus and a chain. Nelsha made a sound that Marin had not heard from her before and would not forget. He stepped back and let the reunion have its space, and he stood at the edge of the yard and looked up at the cliff and listened to the forges and felt something happening in his chest that he recognized, after a moment, as the peculiar grief of realizing that a thing you'd been carrying for a long time was about to be set down. Not grief for the weight exactly, but for the shape you'd become around it. He was given a room that night, and food, and the particular hospitality of people for whom a debt is a serious thing and must be addressed at the proper time. Nelsha's parents treated him with a courtesy that was almost formal, and he understood that this was how they held the size of the thing. Some things are too large to be casual about. The next morning he woke early and began to pack. He was almost done when there was a knock at the door. Nelsha came in without waiting for an answer, which was the first new thing she'd done in the 7 days he'd known her, and it made him smile briefly at his pack before he turned around. "You're leaving," she said. "I did what I came to do." "Marin." "You're home," he said gently. That was what needed to happen. What about you?" He looked at her for a moment. "I have a forge to restart, an order book to fill, a house that needs—" He paused. "A house that needs to be a house again." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, very carefully, like someone walking a known but narrow path, "My father would like to speak with you before you go." He looked at her face. There was something there that was not asking him to stay. Precisely, she was too careful with her own wanting for that. Still, after everything, but that was not asking it either. "All right," he said. Her father was a large man, broad in the same way Nelsha was broad, with decades of forge work written into his hands and forearms, and he spoke common well enough for the conversation to happen. He asked Marin what he did, and Marin told him, and the man nodded with the particular nod of someone filing information. "We have," he said, "a problem. We have ore. Very fine ore. From deep in the cliff, a kind of iron that takes an edge unlike anything you've seen, that holds it, that does not rust. We've worked it for generations, and the work is the best in the Eastern Range. But we have no one to work with us. The young people," he paused, "the young people go elsewhere. We are few." Morin looked at his hands. "And you are," the man continued, "a blacksmith without a forge that is working." "My forge works," Morin said. "A blacksmith," the man said carefully, "without a reason to stay in the place where his forge is." The valley outside the window was filling with the morning's first sounds, the forge chorus beginning its day, and through it came the shouts and movements of a working community. People who knew their hands were good and useful and were at the business of using them. "I would need to see the ore," Morin said. The man smiled just slightly. "Of course." He spent the day in the forge with Nelsha's father and two of her uncles, and the ore was everything they said. He had never felt anything like it under the hammer. It answered the heat differently. It took the edge and held it with a precision that made him understand, suddenly, why these people had stayed in their cliff and worked their quiet centuries. Some things are worth staying still for. At the end of the day, washing the day's work from his hands at the trough, he heard footsteps behind him and knew the step. "Well," Nelsha said. He turned. She was in her element here. He could see it, the way the valley fit her, the way the forge sounds settled around her like a landscape settling into the right season. She'd been wearing a work apron when he'd seen her earlier, her hair back, her hands doing what hands do when they know their work. She'd looked, he'd thought, like herself, like whatever self had been waiting underneath the performed stillness of the circus tent. "Your father's made me an offer," Morin said. "I know. I told him I needed to think about it. I know that too." She was watching him with the careful attention she'd given him from the beginning. But it was different now, not looking for the cost underneath the kindness, but looking, simply, at him, at his face. "What is there to think about?" "I have a house," he said. "An anvil that was my father's. A life that is—" He paused. "A life that is still mine, even if I'm not sure I want it to stay the way it is." "What do you want it to be?" she asked. He looked at her. The question was direct and simple, in the way that her most important questions always were. She had stopped hedging around the things that mattered. He thought about when that had changed, sometime between the kitchen table and the road and the moment she'd said Orath in the morning light, and he thought the change was good, and he thought he had not been this certain of anything in a long time. "Different," he said. "I want it to be different." She nodded once. "Stay," she said. Not a plea, not a question, just a word laid out like a tool on a workbench for him to pick up or leave. He picked it up. He sent a letter back with a trader heading west, settling his affairs in the valley village, the house, the workshop, the few debts and credits that needed accounting. The anvil he arranged to have transported because some things don't get left behind. But the trader came back 3 weeks later with more than a receipt. "There's trouble for you in the West Valley," the man said, setting his pack down at the door of the room Marin had been given. His expression had the careful neutrality of someone delivering news he'd rather not. "Someone talked about who you had in your house. The circus men made a formal complaint, and there's a name on a notice in the market square." He paused. "Your name?" Marin sat with this for a moment. "What does the notice say?" "Harboring, theft of property, that's how they're calling her, and something about interference with lawful commerce." Dav shook his head. "I don't think it comes to much, honestly. The magistrate is Holbrook, and Holbrook's a fair man, but it would need addressing." "I know Holbrook," Marin said. "Then you know he won't let it sit uncontested. He'll want your side of it." He told Nelsha that evening, sitting in the small yard behind the forge building with the last of the light going out over the eastern peaks. She heard it without flinching. She was very good at hearing bad news without flinching, which he thought was probably the most heartbreaking skill a person could have. And then she was quiet for a while, looking at the mountains. "You should go back," she said. "I should deal with it," he agreed. "That's not the same thing." "Marin?" "I'm not going back," he said. "But I'll write to Holbrook and give him my account, and I'll get word to Gert, because Gert's opinion of Holbrook matters to him. And I'll instruct my neighbor on the west side to give evidence about the collar if it comes to that, because he saw me take the bolt cutters from the hook, and he knows what I went to do with them." He looked at her. "I refuse to let them make a crime out of cutting a chain off a person." She looked back at him with that long, measuring look, and then she said something in her own language. Not Orath. Something different. Something that had the quality of a conclusion. "What does that mean?" he asked. She considered how to translate it for a moment. "It means someone who argues with the mountain, not because they think they can win, but because someone has to." A pause. "It's not always a compliment." "Is it now?" The corner of her mouth moved. "Yes," she said. "Now it is." He wrote his letters and sent them west, and the reply that came back 6 weeks later was from Gert, not Holbrook, which told him something about how the wind was running. The notice had been taken down, she wrote, in her small, precise hand. The circus had moved on by then. She did not say so, but he read it in the gaps, and Master Holbrook had, upon reviewing the situation, determined that the complaint lacked the legal standing to proceed. No signed contract, no documentation. A chain on a wagon axle was not, in the magistrate's considered opinion, a bill of sale. There was a postscript, very small, at the bottom of the page. "She sounds like someone worth knowing. I hope she is well." He read that postscript to Nelsha. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with a careful gravity, "Write back that she is." He did. It was not a comfortable process. These weeks, the waiting for news, the knowledge that his name was on a wall somewhere in the village he'd grown up in, the particular discomfort of having the life you're building in one place threatened by the mess you've left in another. He told Nelsha all of it, the discomfort and the waiting, and she listened without performing comfort. She was not, he'd learned, a performer of anything she didn't mean, and what she gave him instead was the quality of her attention, which was itself a kind of shelter. In those weeks, he learned the forge. Not quickly, it was not a forge that yielded quickly, but steadily, in the way of a craftsman who respects the work and doesn't rush the learning. The ore was everything he'd been told, and working it was unlike working anything else. It had opinions, specific and unwavering about what it wanted to become, and the work was partly the skilled application of force and partly a conversation in which you had to be willing to listen. He found he was good at this. Nelsha's father told him so one afternoon in the blunt way of a man who does not waste compliments, and Maren believed him. The anvil arrived before winter on the back of a large cart, and Maren felt something shift in him when he touched it again. The familiar, worn, smooth surface, the particular resonance it gave under the hammer. It sat in the forge space they'd made for him, and it looked exactly right there, among the eastern stone and the deep ore and the chorus of all the other forges, like something that had been traveling toward this specific place for a long time. He and Nelsha were married that winter, in the way of her people, which involved a ceremony at the forge and vows taken over hot iron and the specific solemnity of a community that understands. That commitment is a kind of metalwork. You have to know what you're doing. You have to be willing to be changed by the process, and you have to be prepared for the thing you make to last. He said his vows, and she said hers, and he tried once more to say Orath, the word he'd been practicing quietly, alone, for weeks. And this time he got the ending right, the small catching sound at the close of it, and she looked at him with the expression he had learned over months of living alongside her, which was the expression she wore when she was surprised into something warm and didn't bother to hide it anymore. Better, she said, just as she'd said on the road, and her hand found his, and the forges all around them were doing what forges do, speaking in their particular language of heat and metal and the slow, patient work of making, and outside the winter had begun to soften at the edges, just slightly, the way that things do when they're at the turn. The orders came in spring. The first merchant who'd heard about the ore brought a commission for 20 long blades, and then there were more, and by midsummer the forge was running full days and Maren was working beside Nelsha's father and 2 of her cousins and learning, still, from all of them. And in the evenings, sometimes, he would find her sitting at the bench by the window, his small portable workbench, which had come west with him and then back east again, working on something small, a blade or a fitting, or sometimes just a practice piece, and the lamp would be lit in the evening quiet, and the sound of her work would be the sound his father's forge had made at night when he was small, which meant that the world was in its right arrangement, which meant that someone was awake and working, and they were safe. He would sit down across from her and take up his own work, and the silence between them would be the warm kind, full of presence rather than absence. And after a while, she would look up at him, and he would look up at her, and there would be nothing to say, and so they would say nothing, and the lamp would burn, and the evening would move through its hours, and outside the valley, the mountains kept their long watch, patient and indifferent and entirely unmoved by the small improbable fact of 2 people who had been lost finding in each other the place that held. The locket hung on a nail by the forge door. He had put it there one morning without asking, and she had not moved it. In the painted image, the 2 large figures still angled toward the child between them, stiff with formality and alive with everything formality can't quite hide. And the child still held the locket with both small hands, and the locket contained the image, and the image contained the locket, a circle that went all the way down. That was how things were. That was how things stayed.